On the module A328, empires begin. Unit 10, Imperial Ideologies and Cultures of Empire. Page 342. Goebbels maintains that the everyday experiences and interactions of migrants in interwar Paris provide a key to understanding, as he writes in Anti-Imperial Metropolis. The transition from a world of empire to a world of nation states, both the relative freedom from the more extreme forms of segregation and political repression in the colonies, and the racism that migrants found in the metropole shaped the development of anti-colonial politics. Discrimination in employment, wages, social benefits, and housing was the norm. The greater ease of social interaction and the skewed gender ratio among the overwhelmingly male population of black and Asian migrants and sojourners made sex across the colour line much more likely than in the colonies, heightening anxieties about interracial sex and miscegenation in the metropole, and making gender and sexuality as much as race contested frontiers of identity construction and political negotiation. Within this setting, Goebbels observes this social experience of migration was a central engine of anti-colonialism. Organisations and individuals rose to prominence by defending the rights of fellow migrants and by ministering to their housing, employment, legal and social welfare needs. Ethnic and regional associations, student unions, cafes and dance clubs become sites of refuge, clearinghouses of news and ideas and centres of cross-cultural exchange and political organising. Many among the first generation of post-colonial leaders in Africa, Asia and the Caribbean acquired part of their political education and reputations that preceded them back home through activism that linked the challenges of the daily life in imperial metropolis to larger anti-colonial struggles and global inequalities. Thus, Goebbels draws our attention to the importance of controversial themes and foci and of immigration history, patterns of migration and settlement, barriers to advancement in the receiving society, the development of urban enclaves and new social spaces, community welfare organisations and diasporic identity formation, a rooted history of anti-colonial nationalisms without minimising the differences among groups and their standing vis-à-vis the French imperial state. He contends that particular spaces of interaction generated relatively homologous nationalist projects, informed by each other and by French Republican ideology, but also by the most intermediate social concerns of migrant populations among colonial and semi-colonial groups, whom historians conventionally study in isolation. In his view, it is the history of such interactions, not a common apping of European political culture, that accounts for the development of shared political vocabulary and comparable political aims. Hopefully, this section unit has helped you to understand that it was the interplay between metropolitan and colonial knowledges and cultures that shaped identities in both colonies and metropoles, contributing thereby to the functioning of the British and French empires. As Catherine Hall notes, there is an imperative of placing colony and metropole in one Atlantic frame, so as to acknowledge a complex dialect relationship that went both ways, even if an unequal relations of power, while the hybrid cultures of empire contained very often the seed of their own ultimate undoing. An understanding of hybridity is vital to any understanding of how cultures contributed to the maintenance of empires, at least in the 19th century and for part of the 20th. You will have your own views as to what the most important points are, but here is my list. From the early modern period, a range of justifications were proposed for imperial resource extraction and conquest. These include religious, legal, and ethical arguments. Some people did criticise the development of empires, but very often only in the manner in which conquest was undertaken, not the very idea of an empire. Western empires often saw themselves as having a civilizing mission. By the 19th century, biological conceptions of race were increasingly overlaid to the idea of the civilizing mission. The notions of cultural superiority and racial difference that formed part of the imperial ideology had real world consequences for how empires worked. It is clear from even these short experts that both Balfour and Ferry, former prime ministers of Britain and France respectively, believed that a clear cultural distinction could be made between East and West, with the latter developing progressive national democracy and the former remaining wedded to absolutist forms for rule. It is possible to see in these experts an assumption that the West knows what is best for the East. Arguably, this is certainly that we are doing the right thing. It was a key component of the will to rule within the British and French empires. Ideas like these formed part of the imperial habitus of politicians and thereby informed the way in which empires are run. There are, of course, no right answers to the question prompts. Everyone has different preconceptions or assumptions about the former European empires. What is important here is to interrogate your own underlying assumptions and to be aware of them. These they lead you to interpret historical data in less than objective ways. As regards the second question, the way in which individuals at the end of the 19th century might have formed views about empire. My list is as follows: newspaper, novels, plays, music, hall, entertainment, speeches, school, books, teaching, advertisements, branding, packaging, friends, relatives. Did you come up with any others? These are both commonplace, somewhat ephemeral fragments of popular culture. Each evidences, in its own way, some of the imperial ideology we have been discussing. The newspaper report represents different nations at different stages of development and gives an unquestioned depiction of Britain's colonies as forming part of the harmonious family, happy to serve the metropole. The adventure story sets a different tone. A far-flung colony is a setting for savagery and adventure, with indigenous Australians depicted in almost best bestial descriptions. The reception of such items is hard to evaluate. It would certainly not have been uniform. Gender, for example, is an important variable that is explored in more detail. But it seems certain, to me at least, that the pervadance of imperial motives in everyday elements of print culture would have contributed to much of the population developing an imperial habitus to at least some degree. At all levels of society, India was ruled by the British in conjunction with Indians. Within the princely states, mutually, although not equally, beneficial accommodation were reached between high-level British officials and rulers of the states. In areas under direct British control, high-level administrative positions were usually reserved for the British, but large numbers of Indians were involved in running of the country in administrative roles in the police and in the armed forces. This can be taken as evidence of cultural hybridity, the blending of different ideas and perspectives. Rather than ruling by force versus direct resistance, the British made some accommodation to Indian rulers, and Indians in large numbers implicitly identified themselves as British subjects via their often involuntary involvement in the mechanisms of British imperial rule and justice. British rule in India was therefore co-constituted, but on unequal terms. You may have focused on the different elements, but in short summary is as follows. Intellectuals born in French colonies and later educated in Paris, including Firmin, Haiti, Senghor in Senegal, and Fanon in Martinique, raised compelling ideological objections to the French Empire. Their upbringing and education were in the Greater France that stressed assimilation placed them in a different position. They felt French but simultaneously were aware of the exclusion and different in the metropolitan context, while Fanon's intellectual journey of the self-realization led him eventually to participation in the Algerian separatism. The Pan-Africanism to which Firmin and Segner contributed led them towards a more moderate ideological position, one that aimed to secure more equality for colonial populations but within the existing structures of the French Empire. While the cosmopolitanism of the interwar Paris may not have surprised you, the size of the migrant population is perhaps startling. 10% of the population raises some difficulties colony migrants may have encountered as perhaps uprising, although these would have varied depending on variables like education and wealth. But the contention that it was the very adversity these migrants faced that led them to develop new ways of imagining their futures is an interesting one. Colonial migrants travelled to a metropole that provided freedom to think, interact, and associate, but at the same time, it confronted them with the need to develop hybrid cultural forms outside the ideas and norms of the imperial mindset in order to secure a different future. Up to the 18th century, China's rulers were among the most powerful in the world, as early as Han Dynasty period. There were around 50 to 60 million people in the expanding Chinese cultural core, much the same as the Roman Empire. By 1700, a geographically enlarged China supported around 150 million people. By 1800 to over 300 million, and by 1850 over 400 million. Under the Qing Dynasty rule, 1644 to 1911, China became the undisputed superpower of East Asia. Its armies boasted up to 850,000 men and defeated the last significant khans of the inner Asian steppes. Its steppes, artistic and architectural styles influenced neighbouring countries, with some sending tribute or exchange missions to the Qing court. Sheer size justifies looking at how this land empire worked, with its study opening a window onto 5 key issues that thread throughout this unit. China was ruled by Qing Dynasty of the Manchus, who came from outside the core Chinese area. As such, it provides an example of what some historians see as interior or inner empire. How did the Qing manage the politics of difference in their pursuit of the two seemingly competing objectives? The quiescence of the Han Chinese majority and the preservation of difference between the conquest elite and general population. China provides an example of a bureaucratic empire featuring a China-wide bureaucracy, appointed over time by varying combination of examination and recommendation. How did this function? How did this cope with dangers and regionalisation, corruption, and Western intrusion? Qing China provides an example of powerful imperial imagery, which held a destiny up to legitimate Chinese Confucian tradition, interested inside desire good as maintain key hierarchical relations. It was vital Confucius ideas, studied by examining candidates, encapsulated in centuries of Chinese thinking. They emphasized their desirability of holding the right morals and exhibiting the correct manners and behavior. These aspirations were applied to both society and the court, and as the bureaucrats, the Qing Dynasty embraced these traditions and the idea of the court as mediator between heaven and humans. China provides an example of outer as well as inner empire. Empire over the core population. The king included Mongols in regular forces and saw them as allies. The queen's links to the inner Asian steppes held them to dominate vast areas to the north, Mongolia, and west Tibet and today's Xinjiang of the existing Chinese cultural core. So, given that the Queen ruled peripheral groups and did so in a way that differed from unusual Chinese bureaucratic practice, in what ways was the expanded Quang realm an outer empire? China challenged us to think even more carefully about the nature of empire. Was it an empire in its inner as well as its outer facing aspect? Clearly, it was a very large state ruled by an empire, Huangdi, who desired acknowledgement of its superiority by surrounding rulers. But in what ways and for how long did it rule different comparison did the queen become Sinicized, Chinese in character, and the outer region bureaucraticized, the latter as a central bureaucratic state, with its modular forms of governance and culture gradually refused these new areas. In addition, this unit will look at how the West practiced a distinctive type of gunboat imperialism in China from 1839, and it will consider how legacies of imperialism shaped China in the modern day.